My name is Lasitha, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Jefferson Lab. My presentation today is about a machine learning project that we have undertaken at Jefferson Lab named Superconducting Radio Frequency Cavity Fault Analysis using machine learning. This is the outline of my talk. First, I will talk about the motivation behind our project. Then I'll talk about each segment of the project that we've undertaken, starting from SRF cavity or superconducting radio frequency cavity fault classification. Under this, the models that we have developed based on machine learning and deep learning, and some of the unsupervised learning activities we have done with the project, primarily on dimension reduction and visualization of our data. And then some preliminary work and plans for real-time fault prediction in the future. Then I'll conclude with some lessons learned. A quick introduction. So the Thomas Jefferson National Accelerator Facility, or the Jefferson Lab, is an office of science lab dedicated to studying the structure of the nucleus. The main facility of Jefferson Lab is called CEBAF, or the facility right here. Since our project applies to CEBAF, Continuous Electron Beam Accelerator Facility, we'll take a quick look at it. So CEBAF is a continuous waveform recirculating LINAC, utilizing well over 400 superconducting radio frequency cavities to accelerate electrons, up to a recently improved design energy level of 12 giga-electron volts. It is a nuclear physics user facility and is designed to service 4 experimental halls simultaneously. As I mentioned before, the heart of the machine is these cryo modules, shown in the picture, placed in the north and the south LINAC of the CEBAF. And each cryo module has a bunch of superconducting radio frequency cavities in it. So the issue that we're facing is in improving the CEBAF availability. Now, the largest contributor to CEBAF downtime trips are the radio frequency faults that occurs in these superconducting radio frequency cavities. In fact, in this graph, we see that on average, we get about 4.2 RF-related faults from these cavities per hour. This translates to about 2,900 per month to about 3,000 per month. A significant investment has gone into the Energy Reach program with primary upgrades, plasma processing, LINAC hardware improvements to obtain this full energy of 12 giga-electron volts, but we've been facing difficulties to achieve it with acceptable fault rates due to these large-scale RF faults that are occurring. So putting the problem in perspective, we have a method to record data from 12 of the cryo modules in north and south LINACs in CEBAF. And each cryo module houses a collection of 8 SRF cavities. So with this setup, the first question we wanted to answer was which of the 8 cavities given a cryo module failed first. And we are recording 17 individual time series signals or RF signals coming from each cavity while it's working. Therefore, we get 136 total signals from each cryo module. So once we figure out the cavity that failed first, the second question is what type of fault it is. So once if we find answers to these 2 questions, we could come up with this kind of timeline map that I've put here as an example. And I believe that this looks quite busy with many identified RF-related fault types happening in the cavities. The timeline is the x-axis, and the y-axis is the zone of the cryo module and the associated cavities. And as you can see, there are so many RF faults happening. Once we have this kind of timeline, we could do data analysis in 2 ways. The first is post-fault analysis, which is analysis of failures within a short period of time, maybe a few hours, a day, or maybe several days. Now, this can provide critical feedback to control room operators for them to map these fault types to actions. So, for example, if these fast quenches happen, let's say 5 times an hour in a given cavity identified by the data, the operators could reduce the gradient of that cavity so that the failure stops. The other type of analysis is post-run analysis. where we look at the data for a long period of time, possibly several months to a full run, so that we could identify issues with hardware itself. So for example, by analyzing this kind of timeline activity for fall 2018 run, indicated there were 3 cryo modules that were particularly susceptible to microphonics-based faults. The analysis also uncovered a firmware bug that caused approximately 40% of the faults as well. So both this type of analysis is quite vital. However, I'd like to point out that this kind of timeline is actually made by subject matter experts in a brute force manner. And that can be quite difficult. So brute force analysis is cumbersome and time consuming, and also requires extensive subject matter expertise, and basically requires subject matter experts looking into a multiple number of these kind of time series signals. So instead, if we have a fast and automated recognition system, that could save a lot of time and human energy, and would also help us quickly obtain those timeline plots to perform post-fault and post-run analysis. So that is the motivation behind our project. So with that in mind, we set up a data acquisition system, a waveform harvester that was developed to capture RF time series signals after a fault. So the waveform harvester is triggered when a fault happens in the CEBAF cryo modules. The signals, when a fault happens, are recorded and saved. So the recorded signal is like a window here. About 94% of the recorded data precedes the fault and 6% after the fault. We have this kind of static data coming from each window when a fault happens. So with that kind of data, we set out to first develop our system workflow for machine learning. So we have continuous data while the CEBAF machine works, and our data acquisition system is triggered when a fault happens. And the data that I've shown before is backed up into a data set. Then we get help from our subject matter experts to give us some ground truth labels for our 2 questions, identifying the cavity that failed first and the fault label for the type of fault that happened. We use this data set to proceed with machine learning model development, which usually involves feature engineering, feature selection possibly, and then figuring out the best classification algorithm for our data. And to ultimately provide actionable information for the operators as our end goal. So with that, we actually first construct our master data set. We collect data from January 18, 2019 to March 9, 2020, which gave us 2,375 total number of events for us to analyze. The events were chosen to have RF waveforms recorded from all 8 cavities without any missing data. And we also had a restriction to be sampled at 5 kilohertz. For the machine learning, we actually developed a feature extraction scheme that gave us 192 features, which I will talk about in a little while. But then we obtained a feature matrix of 2375 by 192. And we've actually made this feature matrix public, so people could potentially download it and play with the data and figure out maybe different machine learning pipelines if required. We've also recently obtained a second larger data set, possibly larger data set from summer 2020 run, which is still being investigated. So with our master data set set up, we set out to do machine learning model development. This is the flow that we followed. Once we have the data set with subject matter experts, fault labels and cavity labels, we first do feature engineering. And once we have the feature matrix, as I've shown before, we do basically experiment with classification models with model evaluation, model selection, hyperparameter tuning, final testing, and then ultimately deployment in the CEBAF facility itself. So first, feature engineering. For time series data, there are many feature engineering techniques in literature, starting from simple statistics of data like mean, variance, skewness, kurtosis, number of zero crossings, to a little more involving autoregressive coefficients, to different types of features like time frequency analysis, wavelet transform, and so on, to self-similarity features. Looking into each of these types, we finally selected autoregressive coefficients as our feature extraction algorithm due to its speed, and it turned out that performed quite well with our data. A quick idea about autoregressive coefficients. So autoregression process is basically a regression process that is applied to time series signals in the hopes of predicting the next time step given a time series signal of a certain number of steps. So once the regression model is perfectly fitted to the time series model, the coefficients of the regression model basically takes the most important characteristics of the time series signal, so that the regression model itself can predict the next step quite well. Since these coefficients contain the most important information of the time series signal, they tend to be very good features for machine learning task. So we use those features. So once we have the feature matrix set up, we split the data into training and testing set, with 70% for training and 30% for testing. And then we proceed to experiment with different classification algorithms. For that, we do tenfold cross-validation using the training set with different classification algorithms. And a summary of that for both tasks: identifying the cavity that failed first, and then the identification of fault type are shown here. And interestingly, we see that ensemble models show best performance. And we choose a random forest of those models for us to proceed with constructing our system. And with that, we perform hyperparameter optimization as a second step for the random forest classifier. And then finally, we use the testing data to test and benchmark our whole pipeline. And this table basically summarizes our performance for the data set that we had. Once we construct our system, we deploy our system in the CEBAF machine, and we were able to use our models for online inference from the run that we had from March 10th to 24th, 2020, until we closed down for the pandemic. Fortunately, we had 312 fault events that the model were able to analyze within that time period. And this table summarizes the performance of those models for those events. We construct the table after we got our subsequent experts to analyze those faults as well and provide ground truth data. To summarize, we have a cavity identification accuracy of 88.1% for this data. And the testing accuracy with the data set that we had was 87.9, so which is quite on par. The fault identification accuracy was 82.4, which is a little lower than the testing accuracy we saw, which shows that the fault identification is actually a more complex task. This is the confusion matrices showing the machine learning model performance. The left-hand side is the cavity that failed first, and the right-hand side is the fault. So you can see in some cases the models have missed some fault types because they were actually very low representation in the training set. So these are kind of practical issues that we faced. However, still we had a pretty good performance with those models. With the models well trained and deployed, we had to come up with a method to communicate machine learning output information in a clear and concise manner. For that, we built a tool that can be used to visualize the spatial and temporal nature of these model predictions. This is a snapshot of that tool that we developed, which provides a timeline view as well as this kind of tabulated view. And this is an example case where we could quickly identify this microphonics fault happening in a very frequent manner in cavity 4 of cryo module 1L23, for example. And this kind of trend can quickly be considered by operators to use and try to mitigate that fault from occurring again and again. So, and also our tool was able to provide this kind of long-term post-run kind of analysis that sort of summarizes a run for all cryo modules for a given a long period of time. For example, in this video, like here, this gives a fault, identifies the fault and the cavity associated with that for each of the cryo modules, for North LINAC as well as South LINAC. So some actionable information that our models were able to provide within the latest run. So we saw that the cavity 4 in cryo module 1 L24 here is plagued by microphonics faults, which are shown in this dark red, and also comes up here. The operators were able to turn down the gradient on that cavity on July 25th, 2020, and the faults were drastically reduced as a result. Another case, cavity 8 in cryo module 2 L26 was plagued by electronic quenches, you can see here. And the operators were able to use that information to reduce the gradient on that cavity on September 5th, 2020. And the electronic quenches as a result have stopped. So these are some of the actionable information our models were able to provide within this period of run. To summarize, we have made a master data set for model development. Machine learning pipeline was developed for both cavity and fault identification with benchmark results. We were able to deploy that for online inference. We also built a tool to visualize our model outputs. Along the way, though, we also found some limitations with machine learning modeling, particularly that feature engineering is not trivial. It's a difficult task. And more importantly, the performance of our machine learning models depend on the feature quality that we extract, which requires a lot of domain expertise to figure out the best features for a certain machine learning model and a task. So this led us to go on to our next step in developing deep learning models for the same tasks. So for deep learning, we basically augment our system workflow we had to accommodate deep learning like this. So the advantage of deep learning is basically with the data set that we have, we go straight away to develop deep learning architectures that are able to potentially learn all these intermediate steps by themselves. So this shows the same idea. In machine learning, we have this step-by-step process where human is involved in all cases, like feature engineering, feature extraction, feature selection, and figuring out the best classification algorithm. Whereas in deep learning, the human is only used to construct the deep learning architecture, which uses the data itself to learn all the steps by itself. So a disadvantage of deep learning in that case would be it requires a large number of example data to learn a task properly. So with that in mind, we first looked into deep recurrent learning models because we are working with time series data. Now, deep recurrent learning models are basically based on recurrent neural networks, which are a unique type of neural networks that has recurrent or feedback connections that are specially set up. As you see here on the right-hand side, this is a very simple recurrent neural network architecture that has this unique feedback loop with a unique delay that are designed to capture the temporal features in a time series input. So these are specifically designed for time series data. And an improved version of it is shown here and it's named long short-term memory, which are particularly designed to capture the long-term and short-term relationships in a temporal input. So we base our deep recurrent learning models using long short-term memory networks. And this is the deep recurrent learning model that we developed in-house for our data. And in the front end, we have bidirectional LSTM layers, 3 bidirectional LSTM layers that takes in our raw time series input or RF signal inputs and learns temporal features. And then at the back end, we have constructed 2 classification layers for simultaneous classification. It's a two-branch model to help simultaneous classification for both identifying the cavity that failed first, as well as the type of fault at the same time. The training, validation, and testing for this architecture was done using the dataset that we had, with 60% for training, 20% validation, and 20% for testing. And this shows a summary results for the architecture that we had with different input combinations. So the first is 17 waveforms. As I mentioned before, each cavity gives us 17 different RF signals. So all 17 waveforms and all 8 cavities goes to 136 different RF signals per event. So if you use all that, this is the performance we got. And the next is 4 waveforms per cavity. So from 17 waveforms, we pick 4 waveforms based on the feedback of subject matter experts on the most informative RF waveforms out of the 17. So in a bid to reduce the number of input size so that the network can possibly be trained better. And the corresponding performance is shown here. In the last case, we basically reduce the number of data by choosing the topmost 3 fault classes that are best represented in the dataset. This is to see if our network performance can be improved by reducing less represented classes, to see if class balancing may have an effect on the performance, and the associated performance shown here. So on the overall, we see that the deep learning models may not be performing as well as the machine learning model that we had earlier. We believe this is mostly due to the limited dataset size we had. As I mentioned earlier, deep learning requires a lot of data in order to train properly. We also see overfitting issues here, possibly due to class imbalance. As you can see, the validation and test accuracies improve when we remove the classes that are less represented in the dataset. And we also, deep learning particularly, are susceptible to noise with possible mislabeling happening with human error. To show that our models actually work better with more data, this is some preliminary results with the summer 2020 data. As you can see, we have about 1,500 more events, and it really bumped up the testing accuracies for both cases with more data. So once we had established the first deep recurrent learning architecture, we want to actually look at some other architectures in deep learning, just to see if we can obtain consistent performance across different architectures. So for that, we looked into convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. And CNNs are quite popular in deep learning, particularly in image processing or computer vision applications. And these are particularly designed to process images. Now, we are working with RF signals or time series signals. So in order to use convolutional neural networks, we had to invent this preliminary step of representing our RF signals in an image. So we've actually played with a couple of image representation methods for RF signals. The first is direct mapping, where we sort of arrange each RF signal coming from the cavities in a row-wise manner to obtain this kind of canvas of 136 signals by 8,192, which is the number of time samples in each RF signal. As we see, this kind of image or canvas is quite large. It might be difficult for CNNs to process efficiently. Therefore, once we create it, we actually apply image-based image resizing algorithms to reduce the size to a more manageable size here. And then we use that as input to our convolutional neural networks. Then we develop our CNN in-house with 6 convolutional layers in the front end to process the image that we created. And then again, 2 simultaneous classification layers at the back end to simultaneously classify the cavity that failed first and to figure out the fault type. The other type of image representation we tried is called scaleogram. It is a way to convert 1D time series signals to a time frequency representation matrix. And these are some of the example representations that I've shown here. With this way, we get time frequency representation matrix for each signal. So we stack the signals together to obtain a volumetric input. And then we use that input as the input for our convolutional neural network. And this is a summary of convolutional neural network results. The first is the convolutional neural network that uses the direct mapping of the raw time series as input. And the performance is shown here. And the second is the CNN with the scaleogram as input. And interestingly, we see that with the scaleogram transformation, we seem to lose a lot of data signified with this drop in performance. And it also seems to overfeed the network wildly. Quite interesting. So with the deep learning model setup, we also wanted to obtain an uncertainty computation measure. Now, model's confidence or uncertainty of a classification decision can be quite important for a practical application as the one that we aim at. So, for example, can the operators in the control room trust an automated fault classification output given for a particular downtime trip? So if this classification output came with a measure, a quantity of confidence or an uncertainty, the operators could then either elect to ignore or consider the classification output. The problem with this is standard or deterministic deep learning methods do not capture the model uncertainty, specifically the softmax output that we have in the classification layers, provide this nonlinear transformation that we actually lose the model's uncertainty itself. So another possible way to capture the model uncertainty we found out is Monte Carlo dropout, which is a method that came out quite recently. The idea is that we use this dropout concept that we usually use when we train our networks as a regularization method, and we extend that for our testing. So the way we do that is for each testing example, we run our network, the trained network, multiple forward passes with different dropout masks. This essentially generates this sampling in network weight space. So basically, it appears as if we're using different trained networks each time when we run the forward pass for each testing sample. So that way we collect the statistics, and then we could compute the model's predictive posterior distribution with this Monte Carlo sampling approach. With that, with the mean and variance associated with it, we could obtain the decision, the final decision, as well as the quantification of uncertainty of the model. This is the implementation of the Monte Carlo dropout. So we have a testing set. If we have a testing example, we replicate the example T number of times, which we can set up. It's basically a number of Monte Carlo samples that you would want. And then each example is run through the network with a different dropout configuration. Then we collect all the statistics and then compute the classification results and a model uncertainty associated with that classification. So a quick example that we have. So I've used two measures of uncertainty here. First is variance of the predictive posterior. Now, you would imagine that the variance will be high if the model is more uncertain about a given decision. And the other is the predictive entropy. So the entropy represents the uncertainty in a possible outcome of a random variable. So if the model is more uncertain, the entropy should also be high. And to see if the models, to actually gauge this, we have actually given this box plots for both variance and entropy for the incorrect classifications the model had and versus the correct classifications. So for the incorrect classifications, we can actually see that the model is actually hesitating a lot with a high variance, whereas for correct classifications, mostly the variance is quite low. With some outliers, which the model actually guesses the fault correctly. However, with a lot of variance, that means the model is not certain. Same goes for entropy. We have a high entropy for incorrect classifications and low entropy for correct classifications when the model is confident. So to summarize, we have actually developed models based on two deep learning architectures, the deep recurrent model and the deep convolutional neural networks. And we've experimented with a couple of input representations for CNN. And we've done some preliminary work on model uncertainty quantification framework, and we plan to extend that and deploy it for operators to use soon. We also saw that the overall deep learning performance was a little lower than machine learning models, most probably due to the limited dataset size and embarrassed class representation. And we hope that that would not be the case when we have this larger dataset that we are analyzing right now. So yeah, we expect performance improvements with larger dataset. And we also understand that we need to look into the data more, further study into the underlying structure of the data to understand the data itself. That should help us build better machine learning as well as deep learning models, which means some unsupervised learning. So with that, we actually made a workflow for some unsupervised learning experiments for us to do. So in this case, we actually use the same data set again with the features that we extracted for machine learning. And we use that feature matrix to apply unsupervised learning techniques like dimensional reduction to figure out if we can see the trends that pertains to the fault labels that we got from the subject matter experts. So a quick idea about unsupervised learning, usually divided into two main segments: dimensional reduction, which provides a means of compressing features into a lower dimensional space in the hopes of visualization, better visualization, as well as in some cases to speed up training and inference times of machine learning algorithms. The other is clustering, is a way of grouping data that are similar into the same cluster and dissimilar to different clusters. Both these provide insights into underlying structure and patterns of a data set that might be useful for us to understand how this data is can be used for machine learning. So this is an example for a very popular MNIST hand-written digit recognition task. In its raw form, these digits are images. That means they're in a very high dimensional, they are high dimensional data. We use dimensional reduction techniques like T-SNE or T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding algorithm and such to reduce this dimensionality into a lower dimensional space, in this case, two-dimensional space. And plotting it actually shows some of the clustering that is happening for the similar types of handwritten digits, like number 4, 9, like this. We apply the same idea to our data, to our feature matrix, to see in hopes that we could see different clusters forming for different types of faults. And this is an example of that. So we see some clusters occurring for heat riser show, for example, but we also see some separate clusters forming for the same fault types. So we wanted to look into those further. So for example, controls fault, in this case, that has happened in cavities 3 and 4, seems to be occurring in 3 identifiable clusters here. And looking into it deeper, especially with frequency spectrum for each, we see that for the same fault, the cluster B1, the smaller cluster here, shows this interesting spike in the frequency spectrum at about 1000 Hertz. And for this small cluster, cluster A, there seems to be another different representation in the frequency spectrum, whereas with the larger cluster, a normal representation for the controls fault. So it's quite interesting to see that there seems to be some different manifestations of the same fault type. This is another example for single cavity turn-off events, as annotated by subject matter experts. Here, we also see again a smaller cluster with quite a different frequency spectrum than the larger cluster, which represents the typical single cavity turn-off events with quite a different frequency spectrum. And we also see that this kind of separation seems to happen with in some cases with particular cavity and particular module as well. So this is useful information that we got from investigation into clusters forming within the same fault type, and we see evidence for clustering based on cavity as well as the module. And we also see some clustering within the same cavity and the fault itself. And we could use this valuable insight into different manifestations of the same fault types, for example, as feedback to the subject matter experts themselves to understand these different representations. And for example, in this case, the subject matter experts eventually identified that there was an issue specifically with this smaller cluster where the control loop issue that manifests as a different response in the frequency spectrum, whereas cluster C1 represents the usual typical controls fault events. So this, with this kind of anomalies that we see, confirm to us that figuring out that the fault type itself is a very complex problem, and it also warrants further study into unsupervised learning. So we've actually started working on more unsupervised learning in a more deeper sense by using feature learning framework such as this one. It's shapelet learning for unsupervised multivariate time series clustering, which we just started, and hopefully we can provide some results with that in the future. So with that background study set up, our end goal was to extend all this into the feasibility, or to figure out if we could predict a fault before it happens. So we already have a system workflow for classification of fault afterwards. So in this case, we would want to tap into the continuous data itself to perform data stream mining and hopefully arrive at a place where we could do real-time fault prediction so that we could identify a fault before the fault happens itself and see whether we could get the operators perform timely action so that we could mitigate that fault from happening. So for this, we first wanted to do a feasibility study. We wanted to know whether we could do fault prediction in the first place. So we have this data that the static data set that we have, which represents, again, about 94% of the data preceding the fault onset, and then about 6% after the fault onset. So we were trying to use the same data set for our feasibility study, and hopefully to provide some motivation for real-time fault prediction as well. So for this, we thought maybe we should use a portion of the data preceding the fault onset for prediction activity. And then we designed moving window-based prediction analysis. So we used the same waveforms that we had before. And then we tried to use that data to see whether we could use the data preceding the fault onset around here to provide information about the type of fault itself. So for this, we designed a window-based analysis. First, we got a baseline result by using the whole signal, as if we've done before, to obtain the classification accuracy if we had the whole signal. Then we tested the window-based approach with the performance of the whole signal to see if we could arrive at good prediction. Right? So for that, we basically declare a window of a certain size. Then we extract the signal within that window. Then we use that signal with our classification models to see whether we could figure out the type of fault before the fault onset occurs. Then we move the window closer and closer to the fault onset to see whether the performance of our classification models improve when the signals get closer and closer to the fault onset itself. So with that performance, we actually got some, with that experiment, we got some performance results as an intermediate step for fault prediction. So we're trying to predict a fault type before it occurs. So this is, these are the graphs that we got, and we've separated the graph for each fault type here, starting from single cavity turnoff, quench 100 milliseconds, microphonics, multi-cavity turnoff, and so on. And we've tested with different window sizes, starting from 100 milliseconds of data to 200 milliseconds, and then 300 milliseconds. And 0 here represents the fault onset, and this end represents the start of the window. So how early the window is set up. Here it's a 600 milliseconds before. And as you can see, as it gets closer, classifier's performance improves because the signal that we extract is actually closer and closer to the fault onset itself. And it's interesting, we see that in some cases, in some fault types, the models are indeed able to predict the type of fault before it occurs. Whereas in some other fault types, like multi-cavity turnoff, and here 3 millisecond quenches is probably too quick for the models to figure out. Heat riser choke and these some other fault types are harder for the models to figure out. So with that feasibility study, we see that models are able to predict the fault type several hundred milliseconds ahead of time for some types of faults. So its performance is fault dependent. This motivates further study into fault prediction itself, and also the possibility of fault mitigation given the lead times that we have experimented on with 600 milliseconds and so on. So with that feasibility study, we went ahead and started planning for our real-time machine learning models for streaming data. Now, conventional machine learning and deep learning models are trained using static data sets and applied to static data. Alternatively, for real-time machine learning, we would want to treat data as a continuous stream. And then with that, the models need to have the ability to process each example as it becomes available in an inspect once, predict, and discard manner. And we would also want to routinely update the models as it is exposed to new data. And hopefully we could do some research on real-time learning methods, which is a rapidly expanding field within deep learning itself. So for that, we have this preliminary plan set up with continuous data coming from a low-level RF system that we are designing right now that should become operational in a few months. With that, we are planning to apply our models to the continuous data. The models will be processing this data in an inspect once, predict, and discard manner. While the model performs that, we plan to extract some of the data randomly to store and then obtain labels and update the models in a routine manner. The models will be processing the data in a two-step process where first we'll have to figure out whether the data represents normal operation or an imminent failure. If it is an imminent failure, the next step would be for the model to figure out the hardware component that is going to fail and the type of fault that's going to occur. So with that, we'll talk about some of the lessons learned while we performed our project for the first year. The first thing we understood was that the labeling or hand labeling is a hard and expensive task. In fact, understanding the complex mechanisms that gives rise to this data that we collect is not trivial at all. And we also learned by our experience that the data exploration before we even started to construct our model is quite important because data often contains duplicate entries with different labels, some missing data, etc., that may actually impact both machine learning and deep learning models very adversely. We also learned that feature engineering in machine learning can be quite time consuming. Therefore, we plan to work more on deep learning in the future, potentially with more data that we have. And we also ran into some potential issues with the third-party software, something to keep in mind about version control, robustness, and longevity, etc. Finally, less RF-related downtime trips are good for the operators. However, we found it very bad for the data-hungry deep learning models. To summarize, we have made significant progress in the first year of the project. In fact, in that, we have trained and deployed a benchmark machine learning system for online cavity and fault identification. And we've shown some good initial results on the current operational data. And we also built a system that provided feedback to the SMEs and controllers. And we've also developed some deep learning methods for cavity and fault identification. We plan to move ahead with those the second year. So future work, we plan to develop unsupervised learning methods further to potentially types and improve overall performance. And we plan to train models on additional data, specifically the deep learning models, to hopefully improve the performance to machine learning level or probably even beyond. And then further investigations into fault prediction and our end goal of developing real-time inference and learning models in the future. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues and team members. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.